It began on a cold November evening in 1939 inside a beer hall soaked in history, anger, and the echoes of a failed revolution. Munich's Burgerbräu Keller had once been the birthplace of Adolf Hitler's political myth, the place where he launched the beer hall putsch in 1923. 16 years later, the hall was lit again by chandeliers and cigarette smoke as thousands of loyal Nazis packed themselves shoulder to shoulder to hear the Führer deliver his annual commemorative speech. Outside, the streets were wet with winter rain, the air thick with the tension of a continent at war. Few understood how fragile the Nazi regime truly was in those early months of World War II. Fewer still imagined that on this very night, at this very gathering, an explosion was waiting beneath the floorboards, a bomb whose single purpose was to end Hitler's life and possibly alter the entire course of world history. At exactly 8 p.m., Hitler stepped into the hall, his presence triggering a roar of applause. His uniform glimmered beneath the spotlights, and his posture reflected a man convinced of his own destiny. He approached the podium, unaware that just inches from where his boots would stand, a hidden cavity inside a stone pillar held an intricate, timed explosive. It had been carefully placed by a man he had never met, a man who wanted nothing but to stop the war before it consumed millions. Yet at this moment, the crowd saw only Hitler's fierce gaze as he launched into his speech. His voice ricocheted off the wooden rafters, rising and falling in the fiery cadence that his followers believed could bend history itself. No one noticed the bomb. No one noticed the ticking. And certainly no one imagined that the very speech being delivered, its timing, its length, its rhythm, would become the thin line between survival and assassination. While Hitler spoke, Berlin awaited his return. Weather threatened to disrupt his schedule, and destiny itself hovered in the air above the crowd. In the Burgerbräu Keller, the noise was deafening, but fate was whispering quietly from inside that pillar, waiting for its moment.
Hours earlier, while Munich prepared for the rally, a lone figure named Georg Elser moved like a shadow through the city. A quiet, unassuming carpenter from Württemberg, Elser was not part of any network, any spy ring, or any underground militia. He was simply a German citizen who saw the rising brutality of Nazism and understood what most refused to admit. The war was a catastrophe waiting to unfold, and Hitler was dragging Europe toward ruin. Over many nights, Elser had slipped into the Burgerbräu Keller after closing hours, secretly chiseling the inside of a stone pillar until it was hollow enough to conceal a bomb. He worked in silence, listening for footsteps, locking himself inside the hall and cleaning up every speck of dust so no one noticed. His device was a marvel of patience, 2 clock mechanisms wired to detonate at the exact time Hitler was scheduled to be standing at the podium. Elser knew the schedule by heart. Hitler always spoke for at least an hour, often longer. It was predictable, precise, almost ritualistic. And so Elser built a bomb that would ignite at 9:20 p.m., guaranteeing that Hitler would still be within killing range. But on this night, something unexpected happened. War had spread across Europe. Weather conditions were worsening. Fog threatened to ground Hitler's plane. These pressures forced a sudden and rare decision. Hitler would shorten his speech so he could catch a train back to Berlin instead of flying. It was a small decision, barely noticed by the Nazi officials gathered around him, yet it unknowingly placed Hitler on a collision course with destiny. Inside the Burgerbräu Keller, as Elser's bomb quietly counted down, the Führer's speech took on a rushed, clipped rhythm. He wasn't lingering on emotional crescendos as he usually did. His pauses were shorter, his gestures tighter. He spoke more like a man conscious of time than a dictator indulging in performance. The crowd didn't fully register the change, but history would. Because Hitler's adjusted timing, his choice to cut minutes from his speech, would pull him out of the hall exactly 13 minutes before the bomb erupted. In that small window, an entire future of devastation was allowed to continue. As Hitler pushed through his speech, the atmosphere inside the Burgerbräu Keller felt strangely electric, as if the walls themselves sensed the tension tightening with every passing minute. His followers listened with rapt attention, cheering at familiar lines about destiny, sacrifice, and the so-called rebirth of Germany. Many in the crowd had been with him since the early days of the Nazi movement. To them, this place was sacred ground. Wooden beams stained with years of beer and cigarette smoke bore witness to their fanaticism. But hidden behind that very nostalgia was the quiet presence of Elzer's bomb. It sat nestled inside the stone pillar behind the podium, its clockwork gears moving steadily toward the moment of detonation. No one, not the guards, not the engineers, not the fanatically loyal Hitler Youth volunteers, had suspected anything. The hall had been inspected earlier in the day, but Elzer's craftsmanship was meticulous. He had carved the stone cavity manually, rebuilt the outer layer perfectly, and camouflaged every trace of his intrusion. His device could have blown apart half the hall, sending masonry, timber, and metal shrapnel in all directions. It was a weapon designed for maximum lethality, designed to end a dictatorship before it fully engulfed Europe. Hitler, however, remained unaware. The only thing on his mind was the worsening weather and the urgency to return to Berlin. Intelligence briefings awaited him, discussions with his generals demanded his presence, and the thought of traveling by train instead of plane meant he had no time to waste. So, as he neared the 40-minute mark of his speech, he did something extraordinarily rare. He began wrapping up early. His sentences became shorter, his rhetoric less theatrical. Those closest to the stage even exchanged surprised glances. This was not typical Hitlerian showmanship. Still, the audience clapped and roared with devotion, oblivious to the fact that every second counted. Behind him, inside the pillar, the bomb's timer ticked relentlessly. Outside, the night grew colder, as fog crept along Munich's streets. The world was aligning itself around a single moment in time, a crossing of paths between one man who sought absolute power and another who sacrificed everything to stop him. In the vast timeline of history, minutes rarely matter, but tonight they would become the thinnest barrier between survival and death.
At 9:07 p.m., Adolf Hitler stepped away from the podium, still basking in the applause that chased him toward the exit. His entourage closed in around him, the familiar ring of bodyguards, officers, and party officials who never allowed the Führer more than a few steps of unprotected space. They ushered him quickly down the aisle, weaving through the crowd of devoted followers who reached out to shake his hand or shout their loyalty. The sound of boots striking the wooden floor echoed through the hall as Hitler moved toward the doors, unaware that the entire structure he had just left was a ticking death trap. Outside, a convoy of cars waited with engines running. He descended the steps of the beer hall briskly, his mind already shifting to logistics, to Berlin, to the war effort. He could still hear the muffled chants from inside as he climbed into his car. Heil Hitler, rising like a final farewell. By the time the convoy pulled away from the curb and accelerated into the fog-soaked night, there were exactly 13 minutes left on the timer. Inside the Burgerbräu Keller, the energy remained high. Senior Nazi officials mingled with party members, exchanging drinks, jokes, and celebratory toasts. None of them knew that the podium, now standing empty in the dim glow of the hall's chandeliers, was seconds away from disintegration. And somewhere in Munich, George Elzer, who had already tried to flee the city, was being stopped by border guards who found suspicious materials in his pockets. He attempted to stay calm, but in that moment, the threads of fate were tightening everywhere. At 9:20 p.m., with the precision of a mechanical heartbeat, the bomb detonated. A violent explosion ripped through the stone pillar, sending a roaring shockwave across the hall. The blast tore through tables, chairs, beams, everything within its radius. Clouds of dust swallowed the room in seconds. People closest to the stage were thrown backward, as wood splintered, glass shattered, and metal twisted like paper. Screams pierced the chaos as bodies hit the floor. 8 people were killed instantly. More than 60 were injured. And the podium where Hitler had stood just moments earlier was reduced to rubble. The bomb had done its job perfectly. The only flaw was timing.
The explosion inside the Burgerbraukeller was so powerful that it shook nearby buildings, sending vibrations through Munich's narrow streets. Windows shattered, debris rained onto the pavement, and a thick cloud of dust poured out of the hall's entrance like smoke from a collapsing mine shaft. Inside, what had been a hall packed with celebratory attendees only moments earlier was now a landscape of devastation. Chandeliers had fallen from the ceiling, wooden beams dangled like broken limbs. People crawled across the floor, coughing, screaming, reaching out through the haze for friends and family. One moment they were raising glasses, the next they were buried under rubble. The suddenness of the disaster left the survivors dazed and disoriented. Many believed they were under attack from foreign bombers or spies. Others simply couldn't process the reality that the very foundation of the hall had exploded beneath their feet. Yet amid the chaos, one truth began to spread like wildfire among the shaken survivors. Hitler had already left. A murmur rippled through the crowd, astonishment mixed with fear, because everyone understood what that meant. Had he stayed mere minutes longer, he would have been standing exactly where the destruction was now the most severe. Nazi officials scrambled into action. Uniformed officers rushed toward the stage area, digging through rubble with their bare hands to rescue the injured and recover the dead. The air grew thick with the smell of smoke, plaster dust, and the metallic tang of spilled blood. Outside, sirens began wailing as emergency vehicles raced toward the scene. Within minutes, the area around the Burgerbraukeller transformed into a swarm of police cars, ambulances, and SS vehicles. It didn't take long for senior Nazi officials to grasp the implications. This was not an accident. This was an assassination attempt, a bold and precise one. While panicked survivors streamed out of the hall, many in shock or barely conscious, the Nazi leadership quickly formed a perimeter, blocking access and securing the site. But no matter how fast they tried to regain control, they couldn't change what had just happened. The Führer had walked away from near-certain death because of a schedule change. Fate had swung its pendulum, granting him an escape so narrow it seemed almost supernatural. And in that moment, the regime realized that someone had come terrifyingly close to altering the path of history.
As word of the bombing spread across Munich, Hitler's train pushed through the German countryside, unaware of the carnage unfolding behind him. He was reading documents, reviewing military plans, and preparing for the next phase of the war, completely oblivious to the fact that his life had just been spared by 13 minutes. It wasn't until officials radioed the security detail aboard the train that Hitler received the news. His initial reaction was a mixture of shock and fury. He demanded to know who was responsible, how the bomb had been planted, and why the attack had occurred on such a symbolic day. When he learned that the explosion had destroyed the podium where he had stood moments earlier, he reportedly fell into a brief, stunned silence. For a man who believed in destiny and the shaping of a grand historical mission, surviving such a precise assassination attempt only reinforced his sense of invincibility. Hitler became convinced that fate, what he often called providence, had personally intervened to protect him. That belief, already deeply rooted in his worldview, grew even stronger. To him, this wasn't a narrow escape. It was a divine confirmation of his mission. Back in Munich, investigators worked feverishly, picking through debris, collecting fragments, and interrogating witnesses. The Nazi regime was desperate to piece together the sequence of events before rumors spread. Hitler's propaganda minister, Joseph Goebbels, quickly seized the moment. He crafted a narrative framing the bombing as an attack orchestrated by Britain and its intelligence networks, claiming the explosion was part of a foreign conspiracy to decapitate German leadership. It was a convenient explanation, simple, patriotic, and useful for fueling public rage against the Allies. But the truth was far more inconvenient. Within hours of the blast, news reached Munich that a suspicious man had been caught near the Swiss border. Georg Elser, nervous, alone, and carrying tools identical to those used in the bomb's construction. The materials found in his pockets, along with his behavior, made him the prime suspect. When interrogated, he quietly admitted his intentions. He had acted alone. No spies, no foreign governments. Just a single man who believed stopping Hitler might save millions of lives. It was a confession the Nazi regime refused to publicly acknowledge, because the idea that one ordinary citizen could come so close to killing Hitler was too humiliating, too dangerous for their carefully crafted image of absolute control.
Georg Elser's interrogation soon became a brutal ordeal. He was dragged into a series of cold, dimly lit rooms where Gestapo agents fired question after question, refusing to accept his calm, unwavering claim that he had acted entirely on his own. The notion infuriated them. They believed no lone carpenter could have carried out such a sophisticated operation without the backing of British intelligence, the French underground, or some other foreign network. But Elser remained steadfast. He explained how he had spent weeks observing Hitler's patterns, studying the architecture of the beer hall, and gathering scrap materials from local workshops to build the explosive. He described in detail how he had hidden inside the Burger Bräukeller night after night, carving a cavity in the stone pillar with painstaking precision. His recollection was so clear, so accurate, that even his interrogators struggled to dismiss it. Yet instead of accepting the truth, they tortured him, demanding names, conspirators, accomplices he did not have. Every blow, every threat, every hour of torment only reinforced his remarkable resolve. Elser had not acted for glory or recognition. He had taken his stand because he believed Germany was heading toward destruction, and one death, even a dictator's, might prevent millions more. While Elser endured the cruelty of Nazi questioning, Hitler was already weaponizing the assassination attempt to strengthen his regime. He framed the event as proof of foreign treachery and used it to rally German citizens behind his leadership. Newspapers published exaggerated accounts of the bombing, emphasizing the barbarity of the so-called British plot. Posters and radio broadcasts praised Hitler's miraculous escape, portraying him as a chosen leader shielded by fate. The narrative was powerful, emotional, and effective. Many citizens, unaware of the truth, felt renewed loyalty. They believed the explosion was an attack on Germany itself, not just on the man who ruled it. Hitler fed this sentiment, presenting himself as the victim of global enemies desperate to bring him down.
And while the regime exploited the situation to tighten its grip, the real perpetrator, the quiet carpenter who had tried to save Europe from catastrophe, was locked away, silenced. Elser's courage went largely unnoticed, buried beneath layers of propaganda. Had the bomb detonated just a little earlier, the world might have remembered him as the man who stopped a tyrant. Instead, he became another prisoner in the machinery of a regime he had tried to destroy.
In the days following the bombing, the Bürgerbräu Keller became a grim symbol of what might have been. Newspapers published photographs of the collapsed ceiling, shattered beams, and the mangled remains of the stone pillar that had concealed Elser's bomb. Crowds gathered outside the hall every day, staring in disbelief at the wreckage. Many whispered that it was a miracle Hitler had survived. Others felt uneasy, sensing that something had gone terribly wrong within their supposedly impenetrable system. Meanwhile, the Nazi leadership scrambled to conceal the truth. They sealed off the site, restricted access to investigators outside their inner circle, and destroyed or manipulated key evidence. Hitler ordered memorial ceremonies for the victims, using each event to stoke nationalism and reinforce his portrayal as a leader under divine protection. He visited hospitals, met with families of the dead, and spoke publicly about the cowardly enemies who sought to destabilize Germany. Each appearance was carefully staged to present an image of strength, resolve, and destiny fulfilled. Yet beneath the polished exterior, the regime was shaken. The bombing exposed vulnerabilities they had long refused to acknowledge. Security protocols were tightened drastically. Events involving Hitler became more controlled, more secretive, and more heavily guarded. Paranoia grew within the higher ranks of the Nazi Party. They began scrutinizing even their own members, convinced that internal betrayal might one day threaten the Führer again. And in private, Hitler himself became more suspicious, more erratic, and more convinced that Providence was guiding him through a path littered with danger. The near-death experience hardened his belief that he was meant to lead Germany to victory, no matter the cost. But for the people of Munich and for the families who lost loved ones in the explosion, the event became a haunting reminder of how fragile life under a totalitarian regime truly was. The Bürgerbräu Keller, once a place of fiery speeches and nationalist fervor, was now a silent monument to the thin line separating history as it unfolded from the history that might have been rewritten forever.
As weeks turned into months, Georg Elser remained imprisoned, his fate sealed by the very courage that had driven him to act. He was transferred between various facilities before finally being sent to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp. There, he lived in isolation, constantly monitored, forbidden from speaking to other prisoners. The Nazis saw him as both a threat and an inconvenience, proof that one ordinary man with no army, no political backing, and no foreign assistance had come within inches of altering the course of history. Hitler refused to allow Elser's story to reach the public. Acknowledging that such a single-handed operation had nearly succeeded would have shattered the illusion of Nazi control. Instead, they staged a narrative in which Elser was a foreign agent, a puppet of British intelligence. Even under brutal interrogation, Elser never changed his confession. He insisted, again and again, that he acted alone, driven only by a desire to stop the spreading war. His resilience baffled his captors. But instead of respecting his conviction, they saw it as further justification to keep him hidden from the world. He was moved once more in 1945 to the Dachau concentration camp, where his life would come to an end shortly before the war collapsed. By then, the human cost of Hitler's survival had become tragically clear. The war escalated with terrifying speed. Cities across Europe burned. Millions of soldiers and civilians died in battles, bombings, and genocidal policies. Every country touched by the conflict felt the impact. Historians later reflected on the chilling irony of that November night in Munich. Had Hitler remained at the podium for a few minutes longer, had he paused for an extra anecdote or responded to a voice in the crowd, the explosion would have killed him instantly. The Nazi regime, deprived of its central figure, might have fractured. The invasion of many countries might never have happened. The Holocaust, the Eastern Front, and the countless horrors associated with them might have been prevented. But history does not bend to what-ifs. It moves through the choices people make and the consequences that follow. Hitler's choice to shorten his speech by a matter of minutes allowed him to escape unscathed, while Elser, who had risked everything to prevent catastrophe, was doomed to be silenced. Yet in the quiet corners of history, Elser's bravery would eventually be recognized as one of the earliest and most selfless acts of resistance against the Nazi regime.
In the final months of the war, as Germany faced imminent collapse and Allied forces closed in from all sides, the Nazi regime moved to eliminate any prisoners they considered politically sensitive. Jörg Elser, still held in special confinement, was among them. On April 9, 1945, just 3 weeks before Hitler's suicide in Berlin, Elser was executed on direct orders from the SS. His death was quiet, unceremonious, and hidden behind the walls of Dachau. The Nazis hoped that by killing him, they could bury the truth of how close Hitler had come to destruction years earlier. Yet even in death, Elser's impact could not be erased. When the war finally ended, survivors emerged from the ruins of Europe with stories of courage, defiance, and sacrifice. Slowly, researchers, historians, and journalists began uncovering the truth behind the 1939 beer hall bombing. Documents, testimonies, and forensic evidence revealed what the Nazi regime had tried so hard to conceal, that the attempt had been the work of a single man with extraordinary conviction. Jörg Elser, marginalized during his lifetime and murdered in silence, became recognized as a symbol of resistance, an ordinary citizen who dared to stand against tyranny. Meanwhile, the ruins of the Bürgerbräukeller stood as a haunting reminder of the night when history's trajectory wavered. The hall continued to exist into the post-war years, but was eventually demolished, leaving behind only photographs, fragments, and memories. Today, the site of the beer hall is no longer a rallying ground, but a quiet urban space, its violent past hidden beneath new foundations and modern structures. Yet the story lives on. It is retold in documentaries, books, museums, and memorial plaques scattered across Germany. The near assassination of Adolf Hitler remains one of the most dramatic, almost moments in world history. A moment when timing, fate, and human intention collided in a single flash of destruction. As viewers and listeners reflect on this story, they are reminded of the fragile nature of history and the profound impact that one individual's courage can have. Jörg Elser acted because he hoped to save lives. Hitler survived because of a 13-minute accident. And the world changed forever because of those opposing currents of fate. In the end, this story is not just about a failed assassination. It is about the power of conscience, the unpredictability of destiny, and the heavy cost of moments that arrive too late.